Hi, everybody. It's Leslie with the New Mexico Small Business Development Center. I'm here with Larry Donahue, an attorney practicing in New Mexico. In today's webinar, we are going to be talking about, not me, I'm not going to do the talking, but Larry's going to be talking about maintaining personal privacy when owning a business. If you have any questions, please type it in the Q&A, and he's really great at picking them up and answering those questions just as quickly as possible. So with all that, Larry, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. And hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This presentation will be available if you contact SBDC. They will give you a copy of this. And so you don't have to take a bunch of notes or anything like that. But I'm going to cover quite a bit of stuff regarding privacy and really maintaining your personal confidences as it relates to your company for protection purposes. But before I begin, let me just tell you about a couple of things about the SBDC. One is they have a lot of information here, links for COVID-related information to businesses. Fortunately, it seems like the economy is starting to pick back up a little bit, but we still have a lot of businesses that are affected with the pandemic. My name is Larry Donahue. I've been an attorney almost 30 years, and I'm going to talk to you about privacy as it relates to being a company owner, business owner. Before I begin, please mute your audio. We find that if you do a zoom ratio that's fit window, that'll make the text look clearer, so easier to read. We'll have some question and answer sessions at the end, as well as please feel free to just type in questions, and I'll do my best to respond interactively while we're going through this. So, why is privacy helpful to businesses? And, why does it even matter? Is it easy to get ownership information on the internet? The answer is yes, and I'm going to show you about that, and we're going to walk through it once so you can see it. The other issue is how do you create a company and maintain the company with personal privacy in mind? At the end of this, you're going to know how to look up company information on the internet, at least for New Mexico. Every state's a little different. Hopefully you'll realize that it's important to think about privacy and then what sort of prudent measures you can take to maintain privacy in your confidences. I'm just about to jump into my slides now, but I want to tell you, I am a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. And the New Mexico SBDC is not a law firm. So technically, we can't give you legal advice. What you need to do is review this information and kind of think of it from a standpoint of just providing general guidance and not specific legal advice. And I'm sure everybody's like, why do we say that? And the reason is just about anything in law has nuances to it. So whatever I say could be false in certain circumstances. And that's why we say that. You really need to speak to somebody, a professional, before you start making some big decisions on the information we're going to give you here. So let's talk about privacy and maintaining privacy. And I want to start with just some general headlines here. I did a Google search yesterday on death threats to business owners. And the laundry list of stuff that comes up is just almost shocking. This first one here, it's a recent development, a donut shop in Chesapeake, Virginia. They received death threats simply because they went to a President Trump, he used to have his little, meetings or his, get a bunch of people there, to talk about politics and what he's got going on. And they took some pictures, posted on social media, and received death threats. One death threat was somebody was threatening their grandchildren, who are the ages of 4 years to 9 months old. There was something about the parlor CEO fleeing the home and going into hiding, after receiving death threats for what they do. This is these are people on the right side of the spectrum and folks on the left threatening them. But we have examples of the opposite, where the left is going after, or the right is going after the left. For instance, the Houston business owner facing death threats after buying a Black Lives Matter billboard. In San Antonio, a chef with a decent restaurant was receiving death threats because he was on CNN and called Governor Abbott selfish. Death threats over something like that. It's insane. But it's not just politics. It's what the business is or does. There's another article I saw with a gun store owner receiving death threats simply for wanting to sell smart guns. But we all know, I'm sure if you've been around this planet long as I have, remember news about abortion clinics and doctors getting killed, or owners of those abortion clinics being targeted. Property owners are targeted, and their families, simply because they're a landlord. And disgruntled tenants, we have story after story of disgruntled tenants going and harassing or doing worse to property owners. This is a big one. Scammers have long used the information on the internet to prey on small businesses and the owners. And there's a lot of scamming and a lot of fraud is perpetrated because they know something about the business in some way. So if they're able to look stuff up and know the names of the owners, it's very likely they're going to be able to talk to the owner, or maybe convince an employee to do something that they shouldn't. So there's lots of reasons here to maintain personal privacy when you're a business owner. It reduces the opportunities or the risks of being scammed, is an easy one. If you're on the far right or far left of the political spectrum, or if you operate a business that could impact somebody somehow, or is otherwise controversial. I have some examples here. I mentioned the landlords, property managers, similar issues, but collection agencies, and that makes sense, right? People get really upset at collection agencies sometimes, and they want to know who's behind that and go seek retribution somehow. Women's health clinics have been targeted. Certain entertainment venues and sectors have been, targeted. I have all kinds of clients with different types of businesses. There's one, I don't remember the exact business, but it was a type of landscaping. And one of his clients didn't like the services he performed and looked him up and started threatening the family over landscaping. We see other issues on competition, where you have a competitor that's watching what the owners of a business are doing, and then they start duplicating things whenever they go and do something new, or go and expand their business somehow. And then finally, we see a lot of this, believe it or not. There's abuse victims, or stalking victims who are trying to run and maintain a business, and they do not want their former abuser or stalker knowing where they're at or what business they are participating in. And so there's a lot of legitimate reasons why you'd want to maintain privacy. And I got to tell you, I'm just going to get political here for a minute. There is a lot of political discourse out there about, in the news and so on, about transparency and corporate transparency, and how it's really important, to be transparent. And I got to tell you, everybody that says that really doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. And why do I say that? Well, have you heard of Enron? That was a public company. You can't get more transparent than a public company. They're required to submit all kinds of forms and documents. They have audits, public audits. They have all kinds of things to maintain transparency. Yet Enron managed to keep a second set of books and defraud a lot of people. So what's the point? A criminal is always going to be a criminal. They're going to lie. They're going to submit false information. So when we talk about transparency, what we're really talking about is, taking away privacy options for hardworking and legitimate business owners. That's all we're talking about. We're not going to make things any safer or better because the criminals are going to still be criminals, and they're going to keep separate sets of books. They're going to submit false information. And so it's really just reducing opportunities for people that have otherwise legitimate needs to maintain their privacy, in my opinion. But with that said, you know, privacy is not good for, you know, these issues, you know, trying to avoid taxes on otherwise legitimately owed taxes. You know, it's not good for criminal or fraudulent enterprises. These, you know, or to launder money. I mean, that's the whole point when people think of transparency, what they're trying to get at. But at the end of the day, these people are lying and cheating anyway. So transparency isn't the issue. It's preventing criminals from committing crimes. And transparency is not it. I'm sorry, it's not it. What we need to do is protect the legitimate folks that are trying to do business and protect themselves and their families. And this is what this presentation is about. So if you're trying to, you know, cut on taxes, I'm not going to be able to help you here. You know, you need to look elsewhere. So let's talk about privacy for a moment and what it means as a business owner. And what you see here is the Secretary of State portal for New Mexico. If you go there, you're going to be presented with their homepage. And I did move to the business services page within the Secretary of State. And what you see there is if you hover over the online services area, they have a business portal. You click on that business portal and you're presented with you get to their older area, which is here, and they have different business services. And the button on the left there is a business search. So when you click on that, you get to this page, and it's a fairly robust search. You can search for different names. You can search for business ID if you know it. And if you don't, if you have just a general idea of the name, you can do a contains search. But at any rate, what I'm going to do is put in the word route, and I'm not a robot. And I did this last night. And what you come back with are a bunch of hits. Roughly, you know, each page is 10 listings of companies, and it looks like they have over 5 pages. So they have over 50 companies that have the word route in the name, but not just the word route, they start with the word route. So I randomly picked a name here, Route for US LLC, and I clicked on it. And what do you get? Now, this is going to be probably hard for you to see, and I'm sorry about that. You can certainly look it up yourself. But what I want you to see is the various information that the state of New Mexico publishes when you create a company. And specifically, we have registered agent information. And you probably can't see it, but although there's a black line, I tried to protect the privacy of these people, even though it's public and you can go and look it up yourself. I just didn't want to be broadcasting it with my presentation here. But they chose to be their own registered agent. So they being one of the owners have listed themselves as the registered agent and went and put their home address down. So I can find the home address of Kyler here just by simply going to the New Mexico Secretary of State. Further down, we have what's called organizer information. And this is sort of unique. Usually you only see one organizer, not 4, but somehow they decided to put all 4 of their names up there as organizers. So if I was trying to figure out who the owners of Route for US LLC were, I think I got a pretty good idea here just looking at this information. Now, what is important to know with New Mexico LLCs, not corporations, LLCs, is that there is no member information disclosed to the state of New Mexico. A member is an owner. So if you were to go to almost every other state in the union, Texas, Arizona, California, you're going to see member information, which are the owners of the company. And that's all public and out there for everybody to see. So New Mexico is one of the states. There's a few others, Delaware, Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, Colorado too, that don't publish ownership information, but almost every other state does. But even though the New Mexico does not publish ownership information, if you go and create your company yourself, that information shows up publicly. So if you care about privacy, and I'll explain further a better way to do this, you really want to find somebody else to set up your company, and you don't want to be the registered agent. You want to have a third party act as your registered agent so that information doesn't show up on the Secretary of State website. Now, what's really a problem with this, excuse me, is that the state of New Mexico puts this information out on the internet, and then other companies screen scrape and grab that data and put it in a database somewhere else. So once this information gets out there, it's sort of out there for good. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is the organizer information, which is listed below. I don't have a way to change that. So once you put your information down as an organizer, it's pretty much permanent for this specific company. So if you decided later that you were doing business and you were afraid of getting harassed or worse, you're going to have to change your company. I mean, literally shut this one down and open up another one and do it more carefully to, to really get it right and protect your privacy. And so that's why I think it's important to do it right from the standpoint, from the get-go, because then you have the privacy, and even if you don't need it, you still got it. And if you do need it, it's there for you, because it's almost like a genie in a bottle. Once you pull the genie out, there's not a lot of great resources to put that genie back in the bottle. So you might be thinking, well, why do I got to put correct information in there? Can I just put Mickey Mouse? And the answer is no, you can't do that. And the reason being is it would be a fraudulent filing. If you intentionally submit false information to the state of New Mexico for creating your company, it's considered a fraudulent filing. So what? Do you go to jail? No, you don't go to jail. But what happens is if you get sued, you have an unfortunate, circumstance, and you have to deal with somebody like me, we're going to tell the court that we think we should be able to pierce the corporate veil and sue you personally, basically effectively removing the liability protection that the LLC or company affords in the first place. And that's really one of the big important reasons you would have an LLC, is for liability protection and for tax advantages. So I could potentially pierce the corporate veil, but that's not the only thing. It is against New Mexico law to submit a fraudulent filing, and that might be used against you in ways that you might not understand today or can't predict today. Also, if you are certain types of businesses could create bigger problems for you. And, one of them would be, for instance, you're a contractor or a subcontractor, where it's important to have accurate information for your license. And if you didn't have accurate information, that could potentially jeopardize your license and really create a domino effect of potential problems for you. The other thing is, what I've seen people do is they're like, fine, I'm not going to put my information down. I'm going to go and I'm going to put my nephew's information down. He doesn't care. Well, okay, but you got two problems with that. One is the nephew is tied to you still, so if somebody really was a diligent researcher and they know about your nephew and they've never seen your nephew around, but they recognize the last name, well, now your anonymity is exposed. But we've seen other issues where the nephew all of a sudden doesn't get along with you anymore. And so the nephew's not signing any paperwork for you. Or worse, they're saying, hey, this company should be mine. You promised me profits and you never delivered. So I'm going to go and take my company because it's my name all over everything. That's an actual story that really happened. The other issue is if heaven forbid they die, then what? You got to deal with their estate, which could be a real problem. So you don't want to get yourself into that situation if you can avoid it. There's other things, why not do something else? I've had questions like, why not operate as a DBA? And that's a DBA is pretty much just a sole proprietorship. Or you have company, you list your company correctly with the Secretary of State, but then you use a different name from what the LLC name is. And that's a separate issue that I'm going to raise in a minute. But when you operate as a DBA or sole proprietorship, you get no liability protection, no tax advantages, and then you need to use your personal name more often when you're interacting with the world, with your company, which could jeopardize your privacy. Why not operate as a trust? The answer there is trusts don't make great business entities, and you could really easily make mistakes, which could have significant legal ramifications. You could lose your liability protection. You could have tax issues that you weren't aware of. So there's a few other issues too that are a little more esoteric, but trusts do not make a great way to get around this issue. What about listing relatives instead of you? And I mentioned that on the previous slide. You could have, maybe it's great until that you don't get along or they die. What about false information? Well, I mentioned the fraudulent filing. Finally, I want to spend time on this. Don't disclose the company name. So we've seen instances where people will create a company called Acme LLC, but then they don't tell anybody they're Acme LLC. They come up with a fake name. It's called a fictitious name or a DBA. In New Mexico, you don't need to file it. So we've seen instances where people will just make up a name and that's their business and they sign that on a contract. They don't tell people they're Acme LLC. The problem with that is if you're doing business with me and my company name is Acme LLC, but I tell you my company name is Larry, then you're doing business with Larry, not Acme LLC. I don't get to rely on the LLC if I don't disclose that. If I put Larry on a contract, you're contracting with Larry, not Acme LLC. Even though I say, hey, no, you're doing business with Acme LLC. No, you're not. You're doing business with whatever the legal name and entity on the contract. And if it's a false name or entity, then you are doing business with me personally. So I lose all kinds of advantages by doing business with that LLC. So under New Mexico law, you have to disclose the legal name of the company. And you have a duty to tell people that it's an LLC or a corporation, or you can lose your liability protection as well. So you really need to disclose the name of the company. So you really have to think about, going back to the New Mexico filing, how you file your company and what information you disclose when you do that. So before I tell you how you can operate anonymously or maintain your privacy, I want to make sure you understand you can't hide your name from everybody, specifically the IRS. They need to know who you are for tax purposes. And there's really no way around that. So you tax cheats, I'm sorry, you're not going to be able to avoid that without breaking the law somehow. The other group are going to be banks, merchant account providers, finance companies, and that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You can't expect to be moving money around and these institutions who have risks to not know who you are personally. And plus they have to file forms with the IRS. So these guys, the banks, merchant account providers, finance companies, they're going to need to know who you are personally as well. But this is all confidential. So an internet searcher, a criminal, a harasser is not going to be able to find out who you are from these groups. But there's others, vendors, and specifically the vendors that take on debt or a risk associated with interacting with you. Lines of credit is an example, but another one a lot of people forget about are companies that do payment in arrears, right? Some utilities, you're paying them for services already rendered. So they're going to probably want to know who you are. Not always. If the company has some credit or they can look them up, then maybe not. But don't be surprised that a vendor is going to demand to know who the owner or owners are. And you need to pick your vendors wisely and carefully. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Licensed professionals, doctors, lawyers, some contractors, depending on the licensing, CPAs, and there's many others. The license themselves are public information. So even though I, as a lawyer, do business as law for small business, I have to be publicly available as a licensed attorney. So it's not, being anonymous and trying to maintain my privacy is not going to work really well as it relates to my law firm. If I wanted to do something else, then maybe I can protect myself. And I need to be careful and think about the issues when my public information is available because of my legal license. And so I do not put my home address for my legal license. I put my business address. So it might come as a surprise to you, but some people don't like us lawyers, right? And you can imagine who that is. That's, if I'm representing company A and I got to go after company B or person B or consumer B, they're not going to like me very much. And if I end up, getting somebody that has a, chip on their shoulder, or they want to go and teach me a lesson, I don't want my home information out there so that they can go and bother my family. They can come to the firm and do whatever they want, but not come to the house. So I've had to think through that and manage that carefully. And you need to do that as well. And you got to be careful because it's difficult to predict what the state agencies are going to do. Sometimes you got to research that or talk to them. And when you talk to them too, words are really cheap. I've heard, one state agency say one thing and another one say a different thing, or I've seen them say one thing and then they go and change their mind, a year later and do something different. So you really need to be careful with the information you give them, and you have to assume they will change the mind or the laws will change. So be careful about just giving out information under the promise of confidentiality or security, because that can change. Finally, businesses that depend on the individual. So less a licensing issue, although I listed lawyers, but we also have, issues with like coaches, real estate agents, you see their smiling face. So, they're selling themselves as part of their service. And so privacy is going to be difficult for them, but they still got to be smart about it. Don't list home addresses on materials. Don't allow home addresses to be available with a search on the internet. Instead, you want to be able to directing everybody to the office, where hopefully things are more secure. You have some sort of way to, prevent, harmful individuals from getting inside the premises somehow. So let's talk about how to maintain privacy as a business owner. And the first step is, I call it an anonymous LLC, but basically you want to hire a third party, not yourself, to form the company for you. And you're going to rely on that third party to help you operate the company long-term, specifically act as the registered agent. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail on that. The reason we want a third party is we don't want your personal name as the organizer, because we cannot get that information off. And as I showed you earlier, it's publicly available. So we don't want your name associated with the Secretary of State filing. And that's how we do it. But that's not where the game ends. You have a lot of other work to do to maintain privacy in the long term. One of the things you need to do is use careful business practices. Be very careful about releasing personal information, and don't do it if you can avoid it. And if you have as I talked about vendors, if you have a vendor that's demanding it, you need to think twice about that vendor. Or are they willing to sign a confidentiality clause? Are they willing to promise to keep your information private? Now, banks, the IRS, they are under federal requirements to maintain that confidentiality. Otherwise, can you imagine the chaos if banks started publicly releasing account holder information, right? That, you know, you'd have so much crime and theft going on. So that doesn't happen, thank God. But when you have a local vendor of some sort, like an internet service provider, why do they need to know who the owner of the darn company is? I've had instances where they've said, well, we need to know your name. What's your first name? And then I tell them authorized. And what's your last name? Representative. And they look at me, your name is authorized representative. And I said, when we're talking about this specific company, my name is authorized representative. And that has actually worked in many instances, not always. And when it doesn't, I have to evaluate the relationship and determine how important it is, number one, and whether I can trust their confidences. The other thing you need to be aware of, and this goes with anonymity, privacy, or not, and that is when you open up accounts, it's in the name of the business. The business is the owner of the bank account. The business is the owner of vendor relationships. It is the lessee if you're leasing property, not you, the company. So you want to make sure the company is listed with all these relationships, not you personally. You know, who the hell are you? I'll explain who you are. You are the authorized representative. You know, it's almost similar to having a child and the child is doing business. The child doesn't have the ability to sign a contract or evaluate anything. You have to operate as its guardian or parent until the child grows up. It's kind of the same with a company, except the company never grows up. You will always be the authorized representative helping the company sign contracts and evaluate deals and so on. So you want the company to be the child, and you are going to sign on behalf of the company as its authorized representative or president or member, but not as your individual name. Finally, this is really the time, if you care about privacy or anonymity, you're trying to protect yourself or your loved ones, you really need to deal with a lawyer and a law firm, please, for the love of God. I compete on the internet with a lot of internet companies and the price is really low. But I can't race to the bottom and offer free services like some of my competition. And the reason for that is I have liability insurance, I have all these other things. And so I end up losing a lot of business to the $0 providers out there. And what happens? Well, I end up suing some of those people because I have a client that's suing them, and we're able to get through their paperwork like we're a flamethrower. And it's sad sometimes because they really worked hard to try and maintain some level of privacy or anonymity, and it just can't be maintained if you don't have the right pieces in place. So a lawyer or law firm is going to be able to give you attorney-client privilege and confidentiality. And that's really important because every day we receive a subpoena or court order to release information. And if that court or subpoena does not have authority over us, it's called jurisdiction, we ignore it. I mean, we literally just make a copy of it, let the client know, and put it in the circular file. And if they do have authority over us, meaning it's a federal or New Mexico, then we do have to respond. But we do it in conjunction with our client. They hire a local counsel. They try to assert our privilege of confidentiality. And sometimes it works, not always. It's not an absolute thing, but it provides a great argument to at least ask the court to seal the records so that the lawsuit isn't public information, for example. So there's a lot of reasons why you want to work with an attorney or law firm to form your company and help you at least put the right pieces of the puzzle in place so you can maintain your privacy. So let's talk about how to form an anonymous LLC. There's a few steps to this. In New Mexico, it's rather easy. And I want to tell you, by the way, for the past few years, the state of New Mexico has been considering revising the Limited Liability Company Act. And there's a lot of good reasons to do so. However, they are also talking about changing this policy that doesn't publish member information. The state of New Mexico is getting caught up in the transparency argument. So if any of you has any pull with any state legislators, please let them know that anonymity, privacy for business owners is important. It really it puts New Mexico on the map. We have a lot of people worldwide talking about the state of New Mexico because of our privacy concerns. And I think that's really something that we should work to maintain because of all the value there. And I think when you're in New Mexico, it's very easy to set up an anonymous company. It looks like this. You own the Anonymous LLC, and that's your operating company. It's that easy. It's you own a company, and you're careful about who the organizer is. You're careful about who the registered agent is. And now you have a company that is not disclosing your private information. You do need the third party, as I mentioned, to be the registered agent and organizer to pull this off. We also need to publish what's called a physical mailing address of the company. And it can be a mailbox. A local convenient UPS box works great. There are third-party providers that do what's called a virtual mailbox or virtual office. Those work great as well. What doesn't work great is your home, and you can't use a PO box, so don't try. And if you're wondering what's the difference between a PO box and a mailbox, the answer is a PO box is the feds. So the state of New Mexico, whether we're talking about the state police or the city of Albuquerque or Belen, Santa Fe, Las Cruces, they don't have the jurisdiction to march a police officer onto the premises to serve a subpoena or court order to the post office. They do, however, have that right with a mailbox, because a mailbox is a third-party provider that's not the federal government. I know, a technical, crazy answer to something, but I get that question a lot. Finally, I mentioned this earlier, and it's really important to understand this. Think of the LLC as a child, and the child is the business. It is going to be paid by the clients and customers, not you. It is going to enter into contracts, not you. It is maintaining the relationships. It is employing people, hiring contractors. You are simply a signer. That's all you are. You're an authorized representative. You sign the contracts on behalf of the child, on behalf of the LLC. And that's how you maintain anonymity. And if your signature is squiggly and hard to read, all the better. So in other states, though, you're going to really see here why New Mexico is such a special state today. If you were in most other states, it's a lot more work. And it looks like this. You, instead of owning the operating company, there's a company in the middle, a holding company. That holding company has to be an anonymous, non-operating entity. So you really limit the possibilities here. It has to be in one of the anonymous states. We usually recommend New Mexico or Wyoming. As I said before, there are other states, but New Mexico and Wyoming have a lot of interesting benefits, and that's why we recommend it. So that holding company, and I have a typo here. You see Anonymous LLC in New Mexico or Wyoming as your operating company. It should say as your holding company. So I apologize about that typo. But the holding company is not operating. And the reason it's not operating is because if it is operating, it has to register in a state. So we don't want it to operate. Also, if it's operating, it creates tax issues and other issues. So it's not operating, it's only holding an asset. That asset being an operating company, what I call a local LLC. So if we were even in the state of Texas, what we would do is form a Texas LLC, that's the operating company, the barber shop, the gun store, whatever it is, it will not be owned by the owner. It will be owned by an anonymous LLC holding company, usually in New Mexico or Wyoming, and then the owner owns the holding company. It's more complicated. The operating company is going to be the company that's doing business in the state that it operates in, that it's located in. And the ownership information, because in Texas, we have to disclose who the owner is. So who is the owner, in my example, of the Texas company? Answer, the anonymous company. That's how we comply with Texas law in this structure. So if you were to look up my hypothetical Texas LLC, you will see the owner as the New Mexico LLC. So the privacy of the actual owner, the individual, is preserved. The problem is, if New Mexico changes its laws, you're going to have to move to this structure. So if you have a New Mexico company today and you're operating anonymously, maintaining your privacy, and then New Mexico changes its laws, you're going to have to go and do some machinations in order to achieve anonymity. So this would be the structure if New Mexico changes its laws. Finally, let's address one other issue that's important. And that is if you're in New Mexico, you want to operate privately, but you're operating in other states too. How does that work? The answer is this mess right here. If you, and what you do is, it's really what I told you on the previous slide. You have an operating company, and again, I have my typo here, and I'm sorry about that. The top parent company is a holding company, not an operating company, but it is the anonymous company that's a holding company that owns the operating company underneath, the child. So the child company is the operating company. That's your business, and it's operating legally in the state of New Mexico. But let's say you also want to operate in Texas. So it's operating in New Mexico and Texas. That's okay. It's operating legally in New Mexico. Now, if we want to operate in Texas, we take the New Mexico company and foreign file it in the state of Texas. So it's one company that's registered in both states. Now, the trick is, when I register in the state of Texas, I have to disclose ownership information. And the answer is, it's this holding company here. So we preserve ownership information because we have the child company owned by the anonymous parent. When I foreign file it in Texas, in New York, Colorado, California, we maintain anonymity because when they ask us who owns the company, the answer is, you don't own the company, because you don't. The company is owned by a different entity. That's the holding company. Now, I do want to bring up that the New Mexico SBDC has some great coaches and people that can help explain some of this for you. So, also, if you have an accountant or CPA, talk to them so they can help you make sure you set this structure up correctly. And there are some tax implications, but it's not that big of a deal. And here's why. The operating company has one owner, the holding company. So it's disregarded for tax purposes. Its profits and losses flow up to the parent. And then you tax yourself at the parent level. And most accountants and CPAs can figure that out pretty easily. But please consult with your tax professional. Make sure you have all of the pieces of the puzzle set up correctly. And then you will benefit by having a strong entity structure that maintains your privacy. So there's a few things I want to make sure you don't forget about when you're thinking about this. One is, if you're operating locally, and I do have a lot of people, by the way, operating on the internet. And so they say they're not operating at all locally. Well, the answer is you may be. If your operations are local, if your butt is sitting in a city somewhere, that city may say, even though you're doing business on the internet, you're still doing business in the city. If you have a W-2 employee, including yourself, you're doing business wherever that individual happens to reside or be doing the business on behalf of the company. And then finally, Amazon has a lot of requirements around this. So if you're selling on Amazon, Amazon is going to require a local business license and utility bill to prove where you are locally in operating and selling on the Amazon platform. So the local license is important, and most cities can barely figure out how to open up their doors every day, let alone have the sophistication to say, okay, how do we allow our local businesses to operate safely and securely so their privacy is maintained? I promise you, most cities haven't thought about that. So you should call them and talk to them and explain the situation and circumstances, and usually they'll help you figure things out. The reason being is cities don't want to lose the tax basis that your business offers. So it's in the city's best interest to get you to file that local business license locally so they can claim the tax basis for the business. So talk to the city, and everybody's going to ask for ownership information. And the question is, how do you get a business license without disclosing personal ownership information so that's not inadvertently released on the internet? That's the issue. Don't forget about the CRS number. And if you're outside New Mexico, most every other state has, some form of sales tax certificates. And some states are going to list that information on the internet. So you need to do a little bit of due diligence and figure out A, what's going to happen there, and then B, how do you avoid that? And I don't have a good rule of thumb for you because every state and jurisdiction is different. And so whatever I tell you now is probably going to be wrong because you want to go to Arizona and I gave you information about Texas or New Mexico. I'm also licensed in Illinois, and that's a whole nother nightmare I won't even get into. So you want to do a little bit of research before you go and dive in another jurisdiction. I mentioned licensures earlier. That's really important. I've had people, no joke, spend a couple $1,000s setting up a whole pyramid of businesses. And, they go and do that without talking to the lawyer first. They do their internet research. They think they got all the issues down. But they say they want to do business with a law firm. So they order online with us. And then they find out, uh-oh, I'm a contractor and all my information is on CID. How do they, what do they do? And the answer is, there's nothing you can do, so you can make sure your home address isn't listed. You can do certain things to protect yourself personally from people finding out where you live, but that's really about it. So if you have any kind of licensure issues or permitting issues with you personally or your business, look into it first before you start spending a ton of time and money putting the right pieces of this puzzle together. And finally, I want to mention what's called the Corporate Transparency Act of 2019. This was, there's that word, it's almost like a dirty word, transparency. It's ridiculous, right? This is for the normal people who are the law-abiding citizens who just want to comply with the law. This is something you have to worry about. Now, fortunately, it's written such that it has a lot of penalties if this information is publicly released. So what it requires you to do is register your company and the ownership information and keep that up to date. Fortunately, that database doesn't exist yet. It's in progress. I don't know when they're going to make it a mandatory reporting requirements. It is law, so it is happening. They just haven't put all the pieces of that puzzle together yet, but I expect that to happen any month, end of the year at the latest. So you are going to have to publish your information with the feds under the Corporate Transparency Act, but it's for law enforcement and banks. It's not for Joe Q Public. But I got to tell you, it worries me a little bit because it seems like the government can't keep their systems from getting hacked constantly. So I don't know what the heck they're going to do about this. If we look at the letter of the law, this seems like it's going to be fine. But the moment they go get themselves hacked by the Chinese or Russians or somebody else, all bets are off. So I think you still need to be prudent, even when you're following the law here. And what does that mean? Well, okay, this is your name, but maybe you don't use your home address. Maybe it's time for you to get a virtual mailbox, with, a provider you trust. We do it. There's a lot of good companies in New Mexico. Regis is another example of a good company that provides these. There's, SBDC can offer some recommendations as well. And maybe you just get that and use that for the IRS, for the feds, and it's just a mailbox somewhere, and you're not giving your home address to anybody that can get hacked. That is a suggestion that I would strongly recommend for everybody. So I'm about to conclude here, but I want to tell you a couple of quick things. Proper training is critical. You need to train yourself and your employees. I mentioned treating the business as a child. It's really a different person. It's not you. Don't mix people with the company. And this is really going to be important with social media. Avoid pictures and talking about the company, and don't talk about individuals. It's not about individuals. It's about the products or services your company offers. The brand should be around the company and the logo and the services, the products you offer, not people, not names, not pictures of people. You should instruct all your employees never to take pictures of each other, even if there's a company outing, a Christmas party or whatever. No pictures. Don't post that stuff on social media. Take a very hard line and tack on all of that. And remember confidentiality agreements. It's not just for the vendors, it's for employees and contractors. And reinforce with everybody that it's to keep people safe. Everybody's safety is on the line here, not just the owners of the business. And the safety is only as good as the weakest link. And remember that. And if you ever try to hire somebody and you get a little yellow flag that you feel they're a little flaky, don't hire. Move on. Find somebody else. Your safety, your privacy is only as strong as the weakest link. So let me give you a couple of examples as I conclude here of people that have lost their privacy, just so you get a sense of like what can happen here. And one of them was a family. It wasn't intentional. It was an inadvertent congratulatory, hey, good job, good luck. Wish you well with your new company, such and such. That's all it took. One message on LinkedIn and boom, privacy destroyed with a brand new company. I had another guy, it's called Who Is, with domains. And one of my clients had a bunch of different domain names that he acquired years ago, thinking, yeah, someday I might do this or that. And sure enough, he decided to do a this or a that. And he used one of his old domain names for the new business. Seems fine, right? But he forgot that his personal information was associated with the domain name. And so right away, as soon as he tied that domain name to his business, he lost his privacy and his anonymity. Similarly, we had a lot of clients use what's called domain privacy. So, my domain name is l4sb.com, SBDC, nmsbdc.org, if, Amazon.com. If you do a who is on those domain names, you'll probably see a privacy shield, meaning there's no specific information. You got to go back to the registrar and they won't release it. Well, the problem is it's just a service. And so if you decide, I had a client who, when they're forming their company, picked a number of different domain names. They bought I don't remember the number. I want to say it was like 10, 15 domain names for different brands. And they weren't sure how they were going to name their company, but they finally landed on a specific name and kept that domain and let the other domains expire. And guess what happened? When the 1 year came around and those domain names expired, the privacy shield came off and his information was on the underlying information once the privacy screen went away. And I had another guy who had privacy screen and there was some sort of bug or problem and his name and information was exposed only for a little while. I don't remember the time frame. I want to say it was about 3-4 days, but that was a big problem for our client. So don't just rely on the privacy screen. You need to be a little more clever and careful how you put the underlying information on your domain names and websites. We had another client who was outed by a litigious former employee. So, there's not a heck of a lot you're going to be able to do with a lawsuit. However, if you have confidentiality in your employment agreement, an employee goes and tries to, out you or, create a problem with that, you can seek court intervention and ask the court to, for a restraining order, gag order. You can ask to seal court records. You aren't without recourse to try and protect yourself if you have the right contract in place. Well, that's about it. We got a few minutes left. We're now in the Q&A session. I appreciate your time thus far, and I hope you found this helpful. If you have any questions, we haven't had any during the presentation, but I'm happy to hear if you have any questions and see if I can point you in the right directions.
Awesome. While we're waiting for questions, I want to update everybody on some of the upcoming webinars, and I do want to invite everyone to visit nmsbdc.org for that no-cost confidential counseling coming up. And Larry, you may be able to tell me a little bit more. On Monday, we have a how the bankruptcy laws are could be beneficial for your business. That's coming up Monday. And you may have some more information. But also next week, we have Google search secrets of the pros, e-commerce and alternative selling methods, basic steps to starting a business in New Mexico, and also understanding employment contracts. And I do want to say one thing is that I love doing the kind of the scrawling of the signature. That's a good little tip there.
Thank you. On the bankruptcy side, that's next Monday. That's going to be Ian Alden, who's a very good tax lawyer. By the way, we are shifting. We did have a bankruptcy attorney that was going to do that. We're having to change that to Ian Alden, who is a tax lawyer. The intention here is not to, some businesses are struggling. And the question is, there's some new rules on the books that might be available for certain businesses to reorganize without shutting down. And so we're going to explain what some of those issues are and rules are and how you might, seek help and guidance to, to save and salvage your business. And so I think it's a really good discussion. Even if you don't think you need it, it would be good to just know, what tools are available for something like that.
And we had a comment come in. Thank you, Larry. Great presentation as all. Well, she said terrific presentation, but we do thank you. And this is your last call for questions before we pop off. Okay, I do not see any questions coming in. So again, we will see you next time, Larry. A great presentation at all. Oh, there is one question. Let's see what we got. Holly asked, what about Facebook page privacy? My name and business is the only thing used, but no. What do you think?
Not exactly sure what she's asking, but I will tell you, Facebook being a social media platform like Twitter or LinkedIn or any of those, I would strongly encourage you not to disclose public information associated with your business. With that said, Facebook is an interesting animal in how they work, because you have your personal account and then you have an associated business account. And what I would recommend, if you really are concerned about privacy there, in the setup with Facebook, would be to set up an unrelated company page and then make yourself an administrator. And so at least you don't have the ownership linkage, although you might have a management or administrator linkage. But the bigger issue and the big risk there is the information you put within Facebook that relates to your business. And so that includes, on your personal page, what you do and who you work for. You might want to think twice and get rid of that and try and create a nice barrier, a Chinese wall, they call it, between your personal profile and information and your business profile and information. If I'm understanding your question correctly.
Absolutely. Create that wall between your business and your personal privacy. So that's all the questions for today. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we will see you at the next webinar. You guys have a great day.
Thank you.